Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something ancient, sacred, and absolutely unforgiving. The world of the sacred Bible, not the Sunday school version you grew up with. The raw, gritty truth that Hollywood documentaries never show you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on this spiritual journey. Now, turn off all the lights. The screen will also dim in a moment to help you relax as you listen to tonight's story. Let's ease into our biblical journey together. Now you're in ancient times, roughly 3,000 years ago. The biblical landscape surrounds you, not in paintings or movies, but in smell, sound, and touch. The good news, you're here, witnessing biblical history in the making. The bad news, you probably won't survive until sunset. The air around you, thick with dust, smoke from cooking fires, and the unmistakable scent of too many people living without modern plumbing. Your bed isn't memory foam, it's just a thin mat on hard-packed dirt. No pillows, no sheets, just rough, woven fabric that scratches against your skin like sandpaper with a grudge. The sounds aren't gentle birdsong or your phone notifications. It's donkeys braying, merchants already shouting, children crying, and a dozen languages mixing in the streets. This isn't a Bible story anymore. This is survival, and you're already failing at it. The sun is just rising over the eastern hills, and already the heat presses down on you like a physical weight. There's no air conditioning here, no electric fans, not even a decent breeze most days. Just relentless sun beating down on mud, brick buildings that trap heat like ancient ovens. By midday, temperatures will soar to levels that would trigger modern heat advisories, and you've got no refrigerated water, no ice, no cooling centers to escape to. Look at your hands, they're not soft from moisturizer and limited manual labor. Here, they're already calloused, cracked from constant work and insufficient water. Your body isn't pampered and protected. It's your only tool for survival in a world that demands physical labor from dawn till dusk. Back pain isn't something you treat with physical therapy or medication. It's just your constant companion, the price of existence. Your clothes aren't chosen for fashion or comfort. They're simple, rough, woven garments, probably just a single tunic that reaches your knees if you're a man, or to your ankles if you're a woman. The fabric is coarse against your skin, nothing like the soft cotton or synthetic blends you're used to. And you own maybe 2 sets of these clothes, one you're wearing, one being washed. That's it. Your entire wardrobe. The smells assault your senses with their intensity. Human waste isn't flushed away, it's collected in pots or simply deposited in designated areas outside living quarters. Even in the best maintained households, the scent of unwashed bodies mingles with smoke from cooking fires and the sharp tang of fermentation. Perfumes exist, yes, but they're expensive luxuries most people never encounter. Instead, the biblical world smells authentic, which is to say, often deeply unpleasant to modern sensibilities. You glance down at your feet. No cushion Nike shoes here. You're either barefoot, the most common option, or wearing simple leather sandals that offer minimal protection against rocky paths, thorns, and the ever-present animal dung in the streets. Your feet will be dirty, calloused, and likely wounded within days. Tetanus shots, antibiotics for infections. Those are millennia away. You're thirsty already, but you can't just turn on a tap or grab a bottle from the fridge. Water comes from wells or cisterns, carried in heavy clay jars, often from considerable distances. And that water, it's not filtered, treated, or tested. It might contain any number of pathogens that could kill you within days. Dysentery isn't just a word in a history book here. It's a constant threat, especially during the dry seasons when water sources become stagnant. Your stomach growls, reminding you that breakfast isn't waiting in the kitchen. Food requires work grinding grain by hand for bread, milking goats collecting eggs if you're fortunate enough to have chickens. Nothing is processed or preserved with modern techniques. Meat is a luxury, eaten perhaps once a week at most. Your diet consists largely of bread, legumes, and seasonal fruits or vegetables. Nutritional deficiencies aren't diagnosed here, they're just lived with, manifesting as weakness, poor healing, night blindness, or a host of other symptoms that no one understands the cause of. The biblical world isn't just physically demanding, it's psychologically jarring for anyone used to modern life. There's no privacy as you understand it. Homes are small, often just 1 or 2 rooms, where entire families eat, sleep, and live together. Bathing isn't a daily occurrence in a private bathroom. It's an occasional luxury in communal spaces. Your bodily functions aren't discreetly hidden behind locked doors, but conducted in shared spaces or outdoors. Night is coming, and with it, darkness unlike anything you've experienced. No streetlights, no ambient glow from electronics, no light pollution brightening the sky. Just profound, complete darkness, broken only by the flicker of oil lamps that provide barely enough light to move around without injury. The darkness brings dangers to wild animals, thieves, or simply the hazards of moving in a world you can barely see. You've been transported to a time before modern medicine, before germ theory, before even basic understanding of disease. That small cut on your hand, in this world it could kill you if it becomes infected. That cough. It might be a simple cold, or it might be the beginning of a disease that will waste you away over painful weeks. The average life expectancy is around 35 years, and that's if you're lucky enough to survive childhood, where mortality rates approach 30%. Every day lived is a victory against odds that would terrify modern humans. The rhythm of life here isn't dictated by clocks, meetings, or digital calendars. It follows the sun, the seasons, the agricultural cycles. Time moves differently, both slower in day-to-day existence and faster in the brevity of lifespans. Children aren't children for long. By age 12 or 13, they're taking on adult responsibilities. Middle age begins in the 20s. Old age, if you reach it, starts in your 40s. As you walk through a biblical village, you notice everyone seems to be working constantly. There are no weekends off, no paid vacations, no retirement plans. From the elderly woman spinning wool to the young child gathering kindling, everyone contributes to survival. Leisure, as you understand it, barely exists. Rest happens in brief moments between tasks or during religious observances. The biblical landscape around you is both beautiful and harsh. The hills of Judea roll away in dusty browns and greens, dotted with olive trees and limestone outcroppings. In the distance, perhaps you can see the shimmering haze above the Dead Sea, or the fertile Jordan Valley cutting through the arid terrain. But this beauty demands respect. A wrong turn while traveling can lead you into waterless regions where dehydration can kill within hours. Sudden storms can transform dry wadis into raging torrents. The environment isn't controlled or tamed, it dictates the terms of human existence. You notice how quiet it is between human sounds. No mechanical hum of electronics, no distant traffic noise, no airplanes overhead. Just the wind, bird calls, the rustle of animals, human voices. The soundscape is organic, immediate, and when human noise ceases during the hottest part of the day, or in the deep night, the silence is profound in a way modern humans rarely experience. As you pass a dwelling, you glimpse inside. The interior is dim, illuminated only by light from a small window and the glow of a cooking fire. Smoke hangs in the air. There are no chimneys, just holes in the roof that allow some of it to escape. The floor is packed earth, perhaps covered with woven mats in wealthier homes. Furniture is minimal, low tables, cushions or mats for sitting, storage jars tucked into corners. No closets, no cabinets, no separate rooms for specific functions. Just an open space where all of life happens. A woman is preparing food, squatting beside a simple clay oven. The grain she's using was ground by hand earlier that morning hours of work. just to create the flour for one day's bread. Nothing is instant or convenient. Every meal represents significant labor, and nothing is wasted. The bones from yesterday's small portion of meat will be boiled for broth. Stale bread will be reused in other dishes. Food insecurity isn't an abstract concept. It's the background radiation of everyday life. With famine just one poor harvest away, the woman's children play nearby, but their games have purpose. The older ones watch the younger, learning childcare. Others practice skills through their play mock hunting, carrying water in small jars, building miniature structures. Childhood isn't protected or prolonged. It's preparation for survival. You notice an older man sitting in the shade, his hands never idle as he repairs a fishing net. His face is weathered beyond his years, a map of wrinkles etched by sun and hardship. His teeth are worn down. Some missing dental care consists of extracting painful teeth. Nothing more. His back is permanently bent from decades of labor. This isn't the dignified aging of modern retirement communities. It's a body used up by the demands of survival. The communal well is the heart of social life. Women gather there, balancing heavy water jars on heads or shoulders. Information spreads here: news, gossip, warnings, celebrations. This is social media in its original form, face-to-face interaction centered around essential daily tasks. The strength of these connections is both beautiful and suffocating. Everyone knows everyone's business. There are no secrets in small biblical communities, no privacy, no anonymous existence. As you continue walking, you pass men working in fields with primitive tools, wooden plows barely scratching the surface of the soil, sickles for harvesting grain by hand, stalk by painful stalk. Agriculture isn't mechanized or efficient. It's back-breaking labor from planting to harvest, always at the mercy of unpredictable weather. Too much rain, too little rain, either can mean starvation. The animals you see aren't pets in the modern sense. They're working partners in survival: donkeys for transport and labor, sheep and goats for milk, meat, and wool, chickens for eggs. Each represents significant investment and care. The relationship is utilitarian but intimate. A shepherd knows each of his sheep individually. Their well-being directly impacts human survival. Your stomach cramps suddenly, a reminder of the unfamiliar bacteria in the water you drank earlier. Intestinal parasites are nearly universal here. They're not diagnosed or treated. They're just one more burden the body must bear. Your immune system, accustomed to the sanitized modern world, is unprepared for the microbial onslaught of biblical reality. The physical discomforts accumulate by the hour. Your feet hurt from unaccustomed walking on uneven ground. Your back aches from unfamiliar postures. Your skin burns under the Mediterranean sun without sunscreen or protective clothing. Your eyes sting from constant smoke. Your lungs labor in the dust. Modern bodies, shaped by comfort and convenience, are ill, prepared for the physical realities that biblical people accepted as normal. As noon approaches, activity slows. The heat becomes unbearable, and those who can retreat to whatever shade is available. This midday pause isn't leisure, it's biological necessity. Working through the hottest hours could mean heat stroke and death. The rhythm of life adapts to environmental realities, not clock-dictated schedules. You notice how differently people carry themselves here. Posture isn't a matter of aesthetics or health advice, it's shaped by function. Women who carry water jars on their heads develop a distinctive straight-backed gait. Men who spend their days bent over crops or crafts have permanently curved spines. Bodies are tools shaped by use, not projects to be optimized for appearance. The smells change as you approach an area where animal skins are being tanned. The stench is overpowering, a combination of urine, animal feces, and rotting organic matter used in the tanning process. Workers stand knee-deep in noxious vats, their hands permanently stained, their lungs damaged by the fumes. These aren't regulated working conditions with safety equipment. This is necessity overriding comfort, health, even basic dignity. You pass a woman grinding grain between two heavy stones. The constant back and forth motion has worn calluses on her hands thick as leather. She'll spend hours at this task, producing just enough flour for her family's daily bread. The arthritis in her hands is visible in the swollen joints, but there's no relief from the work. Pain isn't treated here, it's endured as the inevitable companion to survival. A child runs past, thin but active. You notice the distended belly that suggests parasitic infection, the slightly misshapen leg from a poorly healed break. Medical intervention for children consists primarily of hope and primitive remedies. Many visible conditions, from crossed eyes to club feet, remain untreated, becoming permanent disabilities. The concept of special needs doesn't exist. Those who cannot contribute conventionally find whatever role they can or become burdens on families already stretched to survival limits. The sounds of commerce reach you, a small market where goods are being traded. Money exists, but much business is conducted through barter. The value of items isn't fixed by price tags, but negotiated in extended, relationship-based interactions. Shopping isn't a quick transaction, it's a social process governed by complex cultural norms. Paying the first price offered would mark you immediately as an outsider to be taken advantage of. As you observe the market, you notice the strict gender segregation in roles and spaces. Men and women operate in different spheres, their interactions governed by rules invisible but powerful. Physical contact between unrelated men and women is severely restricted. Conversations follow prescribed patterns. The freedom of interaction you're accustomed to would be scandalous, even dangerous here. The religious dimensions of life are omnipresent. Before eating, people offer blessings. Doorways have small scrolls affixed to them. Regular prayers punctuate the day. Religious observance isn't a matter of personal choice or one aspect of identity. It's the framework within which all of life occurs. The divine isn't a distant concept, but an immediate presence believed to directly influence everything from weather to fertility to political outcomes. You see a group of children playing with homemade toys, dolls fashioned from scraps of cloth, balls made from inflated animal bladders, miniature tools that mimic adult implements. Childhood isn't centered around entertainment or development theories. Play exists, but it's shaped by the practical needs of learning survival skills and social roles. An elderly woman sits mending clothing, her fingers still nimble despite her age. Her value to the community hasn't diminished with her physical strength, her knowledge of medicinal plants, midwifery, food preservation techniques, and cultural traditions makes her essential. The elderly aren't segregated into separate facilities. They remain integrated in family structures, their wisdom respected even as their bodies fail. The division of labor is absolute here, not by choice or political ideology, but by the brutal efficiency of survival. Men handle physically demanding tasks requiring strength. Women manage domestic spaces and certain types of production. Children assume responsibilities appropriate to their size and skills. It's not about fairness or personal fulfillment. It's about community survival through optimal resource allocation. As you're contemplating these differences, you realize that hunger is gnawing at you. Not the mild inconvenience of being a little late for lunch, but a persistent, energy-draining emptiness. Food isn't a given here. It's not waiting in refrigerators and pantries. Every calorie must be fought for, grown, gathered, preserved, prepared. And famine is just one drought or blight away. The people around you understand hunger in a way modern humans have forgotten. As you continue through the village, you notice the homes growing larger and better constructed in one section. Social stratification is visible in the built environment, from the simplest shelters of the poorest to the larger, more elaborate dwellings of merchants, priests, or officials. Status isn't just a social concept, it determines your access to resources, justice, and life opportunities. The inequality isn't hidden or apologized for, it's simply the accepted structure of existence. You pass the edge of the settlement and see burial grounds beyond. Death isn't sanitized or hidden away here. It's immediate, visible, a constant presence. Children routinely see corpses being prepared for burial. Graves are marked simply, if at all. The dead remain present in memory and ritual, not sealed away in distant cemeteries or reduced to sterile ashes. The physical reality of mortality is inescapable. The natural world isn't something you visit on weekends or view through windows. It's where you live, where you work, what you depend on. The relationships between humans, animals, plants, and the elements aren't abstract ecological concepts, but daily lived reality. People read the skies for weather, the behavior of animals for warnings, the patterns of plant growth for seasonal cues. This intimacy with nature is both a profound connection and a dangerous vulnerability. You're starting to feel the first pangs of culture shock, not the mild disorientation of visiting a foreign country, but the profound displacement of stepping across millennia. Everything you take for granted, from morning routines to basic assumptions about how the world works, is absent or transformed beyond recognition. The psychological demands of this adjustment would break many modern minds accustomed to predictability and control. As the day progresses, you begin to appreciate the rhythms of this world, the morning bustle of essential tasks, the quiet retreat during midday heat, the renewed activity as the sun's angle softens, the gathering of community as darkness approaches, the careful conservation of light and energy during night hours. These patterns aren't arbitrary. They're adaptations to environment, shaped by the requirements of survival over countless generations. The most striking realization, as you continue to absorb your biblical surroundings, is how every single thing you need must be actively acquired, processed, and maintained. Nothing in this world is convenient. Water doesn't flow from taps, but must be drawn from wells or springs, often at considerable distance from your dwelling. And that task falls predominantly to women and children who make multiple trips daily, carrying heavy clay jars or animal skin containers. You might see them now, moving with practiced efficiency, their necks and spines aligned perfectly to balance these weighty vessels. The water itself is nothing like what you're accustomed to drinking. It's often cloudy, with visible particles floating in it. Sometimes it carries a distinct mineral taste or the faint scent of the animal skins used to transport it. You might be tempted to boil it all, but fuel is precious, and no one here understands germ theory. Instead, water is sometimes filtered through cloth to remove the largest impurities, or mixed with small amounts of wine or fermented drink that might coincidentally kill some pathogens. But mostly, it's consumed as is, carrying whatever microorganisms happen to be present. Your modern digestive system, accustomed to purified water, would likely rebel within hours. Diarrheal diseases are among the leading causes of death here, particularly for children and the elderly. What modern humans treat with the counter medications and oral rehydration solutions becomes, in this world, a potentially fatal condition. There's wisdom in some of the herbal remedies used. Certain plants do have anti-diarrheal properties, but they're far less effective than modern interventions. Food preparation is equally laborious. The grain that forms the staple of most diets must be threshed to separate it from the chaff, then ground between stones to create flour. This isn't the fine, consistent product you buy in stores. It's coarse, often with small bits of stone from the grinding process mixed in, enough to gradually wear down your teeth over a lifetime. The bread made from this flour is dense, chewy, often containing bits of grit that scratch against your teeth. Cooking doesn't happen on demand. Fires must be built and maintained, which means collecting fuel, usually dried animal dung or wood if it's available. In many regions, wood is scarce and precious. You never casually throw another log on the fire. Each piece of fuel is carefully conserved. The smoke from these cooking fires fills homes, especially in winter when doors and windows might be covered to preserve heat. The resulting respiratory problems are simply accepted as part of life. Food storage presents another challenge entirely. Without refrigeration, foods spoil quickly, especially in the heat. Preservation techniques are limited and labor-intensive. Meat is salted dried or smoked. Fruits might be dried in the sun. Dairy products are transformed through fermentation into forms that last longer, cheeses, yogurts. Grains can be stored for longer periods if kept dry and protected from pests. But even they eventually succumb to insects or mold. The constant battle against food spoilage shapes daily routines and seasonal activities. The seasonal nature of food availability means periods of relative plenty alternate with times of scarcity. The modern expectation of consistent access to any food you desire, regardless of season, would seem like incomprehensible luxury here. Instead, you eat what's available when it's available and develop storage strategies to extend that availability as long as possible. Fresh fruits and vegetables are seasonal treats, not daily expectations. You notice people carefully collecting and storing seeds from the best producing plants, selecting for desirable traits through generations of agricultural practice. This isn't scientific breeding as modern farmers understand it, but it follows the same principles, shaped by observation and practical need, rather than genetic theory. The seeds represent not just next year's crop, but insurance against disaster. If you consume your seed grain during a famine, you have nothing to plant when conditions improve. The experience of hunger is normalized in a way modern humans would find disturbing. Periods of reduced food intake aren't considered emergencies, but expected parts of the annual cycle. The biblical injunctions about caring for widows, orphans, and strangers make practical sense in a world where food insecurity is a constant threat. Those without community support mechanisms face literal starvation. Clothing in the biblical world represents significant investment of resources and labor. The fibers wool from sheep, linen from flax must be harvested, processed, spun into thread, woven into fabric, and then sewn into garments. Each stage requires specialized skills and tools. A single garment might represent weeks or months of work. This explains why clothing is mentioned as valuable enough to be listed in inheritances and worthy of protection under biblical law. The garments themselves are simple by modern standards, tunics and cloaks primarily, with variations based on status, wealth, and regional customs. The colors come from natural dyes, predominantly muted earth tones, with vibrant colors like purple or certain blues being rare and expensive, reserved for the wealthy or for religious purposes. The fabrics are durable but rough against the skin, especially when new. Over time, with washing and wear, they soften somewhat, but never approach the comfort of modern textiles. Washing clothes doesn't involve machines, detergents, or even running water. Instead, garments are taken to water sources, streams, or collected rainwater and beaten against rocks, rubbed with crude soaps made from animal fat and ash, or treated with natural cleansing agents like certain plants with saponin content. The process is physically demanding and time-consuming. Clothes are washed far less frequently than in modern times, and the concept of freshly laundered would bear little resemblance to contemporary expectations. Shelter in the biblical world varies by region, resources, and status, but for most people it's rudimentary by modern standards. Walls of mud, brick, stone, or sometimes wood in more forested regions. Roofs of wooden beams covered with branches, reeds, or clay. Floors of packed earth, perhaps covered with woven mats in more affluent homes. Windows, if they exist, are small openings, sometimes covered with wooden shutters, but rarely with anything transparent. The concept of glass windows is largely unknown to common people. These dwellings offer basic protection from the elements, but they're far from weatherproof by modern standards. Rain often means leaks from the roof. Cold penetrates easily through walls and around doors. Heat builds up during summer days, radiating back during the night. Insects, rodents, and other pests share your living space as unwelcome but inevitable roommates. The concept of furniture is minimal. You might find low tables, mats or cushions for sitting, platforms for sleeping. Most activities happen at floor level: cooking, eating, sleeping, working on crafts. The physical habit of constantly moving between standing and sitting on the ground would quickly become apparent in the ache of unaccustomed muscles. Modern humans, used to chairs, beds, and tables at convenient heights, would find the constant adjustment physically taxing. Hygiene practices bear little resemblance to modern routines. Bathing is an occasional rather than daily practice, limited by water availability and cultural norms. When it happens, it's often in natural water sources or communal facilities, not private bathrooms. The concept of privacy itself differs dramatically. Bodily functions are handled more communally, with designated areas but minimal barriers. The smells we've sanitized out of modern existence are simply part of the background sensory experience. Dental care consists primarily of using twigs from certain trees with natural antibacterial properties to scrub the teeth, sometimes with abrasives like salt. There's no fluoride, no fillings, no extractions except under the most extreme circumstances and without anesthesia. Tooth decay and loss are expected parts of aging. By what we would consider middle age, many people have lost numerous teeth, making eating increasingly difficult and contributing to nutritional deficiencies. Sleep isn't the protected, isolated experience modern humans expect. You don't retreat to a private bedroom with a comfortable mattress and control over light and temperature. Instead, you likely share sleeping space with family members across generations, perhaps with multiple people on the same mat or platform. Your pillow might be a wooden headrest, a stone, or a rolled piece of cloth. The surfaces are hard, the coverings minimal. Night brings profound darkness, unlike anything most modern humans have experienced. Without artificial lighting, the rhythms of sleep more closely follow natural daylight. You sleep when it's dark because there's little you can effectively do without light, and fuel for lamps, usually olive oil, is too precious to waste on extending waking hours without purpose. The darkness brings vulnerability to human threats, to animals, to the psychological weight of the unknown. The sounds of night are both soothing and threatening: the rustle of wind, distant animal calls, the breathing of others nearby, occasional human voices or movements in neighboring dwellings. Without sound, insulated walls, and white noise machines, you hear everything around you. Sleep is lighter, more easily disturbed, but also more in tune with the environment. You develop an unconscious categorization of sounds, which can be safely ignored, which require waking attention. Dreams and nightmares carry different weight in a world where the boundaries between natural and supernatural are perceived as more permeable. A disturbing dream isn't just psychological processing, it might be interpreted as a divine warning or message. Sleep paralysis isn't understood as a neurological phenomenon, but as possible spiritual attack. The night world is filled with meanings and potential dangers beyond the physical. Morning comes not with an alarm clock, but with first light and the sounds of a community stirring. The rhythm of rising is governed by practical needs. Animals must be tended, fires lit, water collected, all before the heat of the day makes work more difficult. The modern luxury of hitting snooze and lingering in bed is inconceivable. When light comes, you rise, joining the community in the daily work of survival. The constant physical demands of biblical life shape bodies differently than modern conditions. People are generally leaner, with more functional muscle developed through daily labor rather than deliberate exercise. Calluses form naturally on hands and feet from constant work and walking on rough surfaces. Joints wear differently, backs curve from repetitive tasks. Bodies adapt to the work they perform, but they also break down faster under the constant strain. Disease in the biblical world is understood primarily through divine or spiritual frameworks, not germ theory or modern medicine. Illness might be interpreted as divine punishment, the result of sin or the work of malevolent spirits. Some treatments, like quarantine for certain skin conditions, coincidentally align with effective medical practice, but they're motivated by religious understanding rather than scientific knowledge. The remedies available combine practical herbal knowledge. Some plants do contain effective medicinal compounds with ritual practices and prayers. The line between medicine and magic isn't clearly drawn. A treatment might involve applying a herbal poultice while reciting specific prayers or performing symbolic actions. The psychological comfort of these familiar rituals undoubtedly helps in some cases, even when the physical interventions are ineffective by modern standards. Pain management is perhaps the starkest difference between biblical and modern medical reality. There are no effective analgesics for serious pain. Wine, a strong drink, might dull sensitivity somewhat, and certain plants have mild pain relieving properties, but nothing approaches the effectiveness of modern pain management. Surgery, when it happens at all, occurs without anesthesia. Childbirth takes place without epidurals or controlled environments. Broken bones, wounds, dental problems, all must be endured with minimal relief. Wounds and injuries that modern medicine treats routinely often become life-threatening in the biblical world. A simple cut can develop into an infected wound that spreads through the body. Broken bones might heal improperly, leaving permanent disability. Internal injuries or conditions requiring surgical intervention are effectively death sentences. The casual physical risks people take in modern life, knowing medical help is available, would be unthinkable gambles here. Childbirth represents one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. Without antiseptic conditions, surgical options, or effective ways to control hemorrhage, many women die in childbirth. Infants face equally precarious odds. Infection, birth injuries, and simple lack of effective interventions for common complications result in high infant mortality. The emotional relationship with pregnancy and birth necessarily differs when it carries such significant risk of death for both mother and child. The dangers aren't limited to disease and injury. Violence is more immediate and normalized in the biblical world. Conflict resolution doesn't happen through police and courts in most situations, but through family or tribal justice systems. Blood feuds, revenge cycles, and community enforcement of norms are common. The biblical injunction of an eye for an eye isn't just spiritual guidance, it's a practical limit on what could otherwise be escalating cycles of retribution. Wild animals present genuine threats in many regions. Wolves, bears, lions, and other predators aren't confined to nature preserves but share the landscape with humans. Shepherds don't just guide their flocks, they defend them and themselves from predators. Travel between communities means exposure to these dangers, along with human threats like bandits or hostile tribes. The environment itself presents hazards unfamiliar to modern humans accustomed to controlled settings. Flash floods transform dry stream beds into raging torrents with little warning. Droughts destroy crops and water sources. Earthquakes, common in regions like the Jordan Valley, strike without the benefit of modern construction standards or emergency response systems. Heat exposure, hypothermia, falling from heights, all represent common dangers without modern safety measures or medical response. Navigation through this world happens without maps, GPS, or even consistent landmarks in many regions. People find their way using knowledge passed through generations, observation of stars and natural features, and established paths. Getting lost isn't an inconvenience but a potentially fatal mistake, especially in desert regions where water sources are scarce and widely separated. As darkness begins to fall, you notice the community drawing closer together, physically and socially. The vulnerability of night creates a boundary between the relative safety of the settlement and the dangerous unknown beyond. Fires are lit not just for cooking and light, but as protection against predators, both animal and human. The perimeter of the community becomes more clearly defined, sometimes with actual barriers, sometimes just with heightened vigilance. The transition to night brings a shift in the social dynamics as well. With work limited by darkness, this becomes time for storytelling, for passing cultural knowledge through generations, for strengthening community bonds. The practical knowledge of survival is embedded in stories, proverbs, and religious teachings. This isn't just entertainment, it's essential education, preserving information vital to community continuation. You observe how vulnerability to external threats shapes the physical arrangement of communities. Settlements are often positioned with defense in mind, on hilltops with good visibility, near water sources but protected from direct attack, with limited access points that can be monitored or defended. Within settlements, the arrangement of dwellings often creates natural surveillance, with doorways facing common areas where community members can observe comings and goings. Privacy as a concept is balanced against the security of visibility. Travelers arrive as the day ends, seeking shelter for the night. Their reception illustrates the complex balance between hospitality as a sacred obligation and caution towards strangers. Questions establish identity, connections, purpose, not as bureaucratic formality, but as essential risk assessment. Who are you? Who are your people? What brings you to our community? The answers determine whether you're welcomed as a guest or regarded with suspicion. The community's relationship with strangers reflects practical realities of biblical life. Travelers genuinely need assistance, shelter, food, water to survive. Communities genuinely need to protect themselves from potential threats. The biblical emphasis on hospitality isn't just moral teaching, it's a practical survival system in a world where today's host might be tomorrow's traveler in need. The mutual obligation creates a network of reciprocity across a dangerous landscape. The dangers of biblical life extend beyond the physical threats of wild animals, harsh environments, or human violence. As you continue to observe this ancient world, you become increasingly aware of the invisible dangers, the psychological and social threats that shape daily existence just as powerfully as any physical peril. Social exclusion in this environment isn't just uncomfortable, it's potentially fatal. Without the support structures of modern society, police forces, welfare systems, homeless shelters, hospitals, individuals separated from their community face almost insurmountable challenges to survival. This reality gives incredible power to social norms and expectations. Conformity isn't a matter of avoiding awkwardness, it's often literally life-preserving. You watch as people navigate complex social hierarchies that determine everything from resource allocation to marriage possibilities to legal standing. These hierarchies aren't just abstract concepts, but lived realities enforced through daily interactions. Age grants authority in most contexts. Gender determines appropriate roles and spaces. Family lineage establishes claims to land, resources, and communal standing. Outsider status, whether as a foreigner, a person with disability, or someone ritually unclean, creates boundaries that can be virtually impossible to cross. The power of shame as a social control mechanism becomes immediately apparent. In a community where everyone knows everyone, where privacy barely exists, and where individual survival depends on collective acceptance, the threat of public humiliation functions as a powerful enforcement mechanism. The biblical emphasis on honor and shame reflects this practical reality. Reputation isn't just about social standing, but about access to the resources and relationships necessary for survival. Disease carries social dimensions beyond its physical effects. Many conditions are understood not just as medical problems, but as signs of spiritual contamination or divine disfavor. Skin diseases like leprosy, which in biblical contexts covered various conditions, not just what modern medicine identifies as Hansen's disease, could result in complete social isolation. The afflicted person must leave the community, call out warnings of their approach, and live in isolation or with other afflicted individuals. This exclusion, while serving some practical quarantine function, creates devastating psychological and social consequences beyond the physical suffering. Mental illness receives no clinical diagnosis or treatment. Behaviors we would now recognize as symptoms of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, or other conditions might be interpreted as divine possession, demonic influence, or spiritual punishment. Some affected individuals might find accommodated roles within society as prophets or seers in some cases, but many would face ostracism, abuse, or abandonment. The suffering is compounded by lack of understanding, effective treatment, or social support systems. The dangers of childbirth extend beyond the physical risks to include social consequences. A woman who dies in childbirth might be mourned, but her death is accepted as common fate. A woman who cannot conceive faces social stigma, potential abandonment, or replacement. The emotional suffering of infertility or pregnancy loss is compounded by social judgment that interprets these outcomes as divine disfavor or punishment. There are no support groups, no fertility treatments, no psychological counseling, just the weight of community judgment added to personal grief. Sexual dangers reflect the power imbalances of biblical society. Women have limited legal recourse against unwanted advances or assault. Their testimony carries less weight than men's in most contexts. Their value is significantly tied to sexual purity, creating both vulnerability to exploitation and devastating consequences if that purity is compromised, regardless of circumstances. The biblical legal codes regarding sexual conduct reflect attempts to create some protections within this fundamentally unequal system, but they remain far from modern concepts of consent, agency, and justice. Political dangers are constant in a world of shifting tribal alliances, expansionist empires, and limited communication. Ordinary people have minimal influence over political decisions that might result in war, displacement, enslavement, or increased taxation. The biblical narratives of conquest, exile, and occupation reflect historical realities where entire communities could be uprooted or destroyed through decisions made in distant capitals by rulers they would never see. Religious conformity carries life or death implications. In many biblical contexts, religious practice isn't a matter of personal choice, but communal identity and survival. Divergence from accepted practices might be interpreted as threatening the community's relationship with divine powers, potentially bringing drought, disease, or military defeat. The severe punishments described for idolatry or breaking ritual laws reflect this understanding. The individual's actions potentially endanger the entire group. Navigating these dangerous social waters requires constant vigilance and knowledge of complex, often unwritten rules. You notice how people modify their speech, posture, and behavior as they interact with different community members, deferential with elders, formal with religious authorities, relaxed with peers. These aren't just social niceties, but survival strategies in a world where a single misstep in social interaction could have severe consequences. The community's religious life provides both structure for navigating these dangers and explanations for their existence. You observe how sacred times punctuate the agricultural and social calendar, creating rhythms that orient the community in time and space. Sabbath observance creates a pause in the relentless work of survival, a sacred boundary that protects both physical rest and spiritual focus. Festival cycles connect present experience with historical memory and future hope, placing current hardships within a larger narrative of divine purpose and promise. Religious practices permeate daily life in ways modern secular societies would find foreign. Food preparation involves not just practical considerations but ritual requirements. Agricultural work includes ceremonial first fruits and gleaning provisions for the vulnerable. Birth, coming of age, marriage, and death are marked with rituals that integrate the individual experience into communal and cosmic significance. The sacred and secular aren't separate domains, but intertwined dimensions of a single reality. The physical locations of religious practice vary widely across biblical periods and regions, but they share common functions. Whether a portable tabernacle, a local shrine, or a centralized temple, sacred spaces create focal points for community identity and divine encounter. The elaborate rituals, specialized personnel, and architectural features all serve to mediate between human and divine realms, managing the perceived dangers and potential benefits of divine presence. You notice the central importance of sacrifice in religious practice, the careful selection of animals, the precise procedures for their slaughter and preparation, the specific allocation of portions, all reflect both practical concerns, providing meat for priests, creating communal meals, and theological understandings, establishing right relationship with divine powers, atoning for wrongdoing. The sensory experience is intense, the sounds of animals, the smell of blood and burning flesh, the visual spectacle of ritual performance, creating powerful psychological impact beyond intellectual understanding. Religious specialists, priests, prophets, wise men and women hold significant social power through their role as interpreters of divine will and mediators of divine presence. Their authority extends beyond specifically religious matters into what modern societies would consider legal, medical, or political domains. The boundaries between religious leadership and other forms of authority are fluid, reflecting an integrated understanding of reality, where divine influences permeate all aspects of life. The prophetic tradition represents a fascinating counterbalance within this social system. While priests generally maintain established traditions and power structures, prophets frequently challenge these same systems, claiming direct divine authorization for their critique. This creates a dynamic tension within biblical religion, institutional stability balanced against charismatic disruption, traditional authority alongside radical critique. You observe how this tension plays out in community responses to prophetic messages, sometimes embraced, sometimes rejected, always engaging fundamental questions of identity and purpose. Sacred texts take on different significance in a predominantly oral culture. What modern readers encounter as written scripture existed for much of biblical history primarily as oral tradition, performed and transmitted in community settings rather than read privately. The relatively few written texts are precious, accessible to a small literate minority, often housed in sacred spaces. The words themselves are understood to carry power, not just as information or instruction, but as effective agents of divine purpose in the world. The interpretive process surrounding sacred texts reflects this understanding of their power and purpose. Interpretation isn't primarily an individual intellectual exercise, but a communal discernment of applicable meaning for present circumstances. You notice how texts are cited, applied, recontextualized in ways that might seem loose or creative by modern academic standards, but serve the essential function of making ancient wisdom present and actionable in current situations. Family structures form the basic unit of social organization and religious practice. The household extends beyond the modern nuclear family to include multiple generations, unmarried relatives, servants or slaves, and others connected through various dependency relationships. The male head of household holds religious responsibility for all members, leading domestic rituals, representing the group in public religious contexts, and ensuring proper instruction and observance. Within these extended family structures, gender roles are clearly defined and hierarchical, though with more complexity than simple male dominance. Men control public religious and political spaces, while women exercise authority in domestic domains including food preparation, textile production, and childcare. These divisions aren't just cultural preferences, but religious obligations, understood as divinely established order. The biblical texts occasionally present exceptions, female prophets, judges, or leaders, but these are portrayed as extraordinary situations, not normative patterns. Age creates another fundamental social division, with elders holding authority based on accumulated experience and wisdom. Children move through clearly defined developmental stages, marked by increasing responsibilities and ritual recognitions. The modern concept of adolescence as an extended transitional period barely exists. Puberty marks the near, immediate transition to adult responsibilities, particularly for girls who might marry soon after first menstruation. Marriage represents not primarily a romantic relationship, but a social and economic alliance between families. The elaborate negotiation of bride prices or dowries, the contractual agreements regarding property and inheritance, the public ceremonies that formalize the union all reflect the community significance of marriage beyond individual preference. While emotional bonds certainly develop within marriages, the institution's primary purpose centers on legitimate reproduction, resource management, and family alliance. As you observe a wedding celebration in the village, you're struck by how different it is from modern ceremonies. The festivities last for days, involving the entire community rather than just invited guests. The elaborate rituals aren't centered around the couple's romantic commitment, but the formal joining of two families, the transfer of the bride from her father's authority to her husband's, and the establishment of a new household within the community structure. The celebration serves multiple social functions: public recognition of the new relationship, community blessing on future fertility, demonstration of both families' social standing through the quality of food and entertainment provided. The concepts of love and attraction exist, but function differently within this social framework. Romantic love might develop within marriages, but it's not considered a necessary foundation for the relationship. The biblical Song of Songs celebrates erotic desire, but most marriages begin with minimal personal connection. Arranged by families based on practical considerations, marriage becomes a partnership that ideally grows into affection and mutual support through shared experience and purpose. The modern expectation of finding one's soulmate would seem both impractical and potentially dangerous in a world where survival depends on community networks rather than individual fulfillment. Child rearing practices reflect both practical necessities and cultural values. Infants are kept close to mothers or other female caregivers, often carried in slings during work, breast for extended periods, due to lack of safe alternatives. Weaning represents a significant transition, often marked by ritual celebration. Discipline tends toward physical punishment and clear hierarchical authority, rather than explanation or negotiation. Children are valued both emotionally and practically as continuation of family lineage, as economic contributors from an early age, as security for parents in old age. Education happens primarily through apprenticeship rather than formal schooling. Children learn by watching and participating in adult activities, gradually assuming more responsibility as their skills develop. Boys typically follow their father's occupations, while girls learn domestic and production skills from mothers and other female relatives. Formal instruction exists primarily for religious purposes or specialized roles. Priests require training in ritual procedures, scribes in writing techniques, craftspeople in specific skills. The vast majority of biblical people, especially women, remain illiterate throughout their lives. Social relationships beyond family extend through complex networks of obligation and reciprocity. You observe how carefully people track debts, not just of money or goods, but of favors, hospitality, and honor. The biblical injunctions regarding lending, debt forgiveness, and care for vulnerable community members reflect the centrality of these reciprocal obligations to social functioning. In a world without institutional safety nets, these personal relationship networks provide the only reliable security against disaster. The experience of time differs dramatically from modern linear progression. Biblical people orient themselves primarily through cyclical patterns, daily routines of sunrise to sunset, weekly Sabbath observances, monthly lunar cycles, annual agricultural and festival calendars. These overlapping cycles create a sense of time as repetitive rather than progressive, with emphasis on maintaining proper order rather than achieving new developments. Historical events are significant primarily as they reveal divine purpose or establish precedent, not as markers of human progress. Language itself reflects these social realities and worldviews. Biblical Hebrew contains rich vocabulary for relationship categories, religious concepts, and agricultural realities, with fewer terms for abstract concepts or psychological states. The language emphasizes concrete imagery over theoretical constructs, action over idea, relationship over individuality. Metaphors drawn from everyday experience, agricultural, pastoral, familial, make abstract theological concepts tangible and immediate. Humor exists but differs from modern sensibilities. Wordplay appears frequently in biblical texts, along with irony, sarcasm, and occasionally bawdy references. Social hierarchy creates particular forms of humor jokes at the expense of outsiders or social inferiors, clever subversion of expectations, celebrations of cunning in the face of power. The modern concept of self-deprecating humor would seem strange in a culture where personal honor must be vigilantly maintained. But humor at the expense of common enemies or rival communities builds group solidarity. Music permeates daily life, serving practical, social, and religious functions simultaneously. Workers sing rhythmic songs to coordinate effort and alleviate monotony. Women sing while grinding grain or drawing water. Children learn cultural knowledge through simple songs. Religious ceremonies incorporate complex musical arrangements with specific instruments designated for particular contexts. Unlike modern passive consumption of recorded music, biblical people actively participate in musical creation as a communal experience that marks significant moments and maintains cultural identity. The sensory experience of ritual creates powerful psychological impacts that modern text-focused approaches to religion often miss. The smell of incense, the taste of sacrificial meals, the sound of chanted prayers, the physical sensations of ritual washing or anointing with oil all engage participants fully in embodied experiences that transcend intellectual understanding. These multi-sensory rituals create both community cohesion and individual transformation, establishing patterns of meaning that structure daily existence. The mental and spiritual challenges of biblical life are matched by relentless physical demands that would overwhelm most modern bodies. As you continue experiencing this ancient world, you become acutely aware of how your body, shaped by modern comforts and medical interventions, is fundamentally unprepared for the harsh realities of daily survival. The constant exposure to the elements takes an immediate toll. In desert and semi-arid regions common to biblical landscapes, daytime temperatures regularly exceed what modern health authorities would classify as dangerous heat levels. There's no escape to air-conditioned spaces, no specially designed moisture-wicking clothing, no electrolyte-enhanced hydration solutions. Your skin burns and blisters under the relentless sun. Your eyes strain against the glare reflected off stone and sand. Your lungs labor in the hot, dust-filled air, and you must continue working despite these conditions. Animals need tending, water must be collected, crops require attention regardless of personal discomfort. Winter brings different challenges. Homes provide minimal insulation against cold. Heating comes from small fires that fill the space with smoke while providing limited warmth. Clothing offers insufficient protection against wind and rain. Cold-related illnesses, from minor respiratory infections to potentially fatal pneumonia, sweep through communities regularly. The elderly and very young are particularly vulnerable, their deaths during winter months considered tragic but expected. part of the natural rhythm of community life. The physical labor required for basic survival would exhaust most modern humans within hours. You watch as people engage in constant, demanding work from dawn until dusk. Women grinding grain between stones develop massive upper body strength, their hands calloused beyond recognition. Men plowing fields or constructing buildings perform the equivalent of an intense CrossFit workout for 10-12 hours daily, without protein supplements or recovery protocols. Children as young as 5 or 6 carry significant burdens, water jugs, younger siblings, bundles of sticks for fuel. The division of labor isn't about fairness or personal fulfillment, but survival efficiency. Bodies are tools to be used optimally for community continuation. The impact of this constant physical demand becomes visible in the bodies around you. People in their 30s show wear equivalent to modern 60-year-olds, joints swollen from arthritis, backs permanently curved from repetitive tasks, teeth worn to nubs from constant use and gritting food. Hands tell life stories through their deformations. The distinctive twist of the shepherd's fingers from years holding a staff, the flattened thumbs of the weaver from pressing threads, the missing digits of the carpenter from inevitable accidents with sharp tools. Injuries are commonplace and often permanent. You notice people with limbs that healed improperly after breaks, creating lifelong disability but not exemption from work. Burns from cooking fires or metalworking leave distinctive scars. Missing eyes from workplace accidents or fighting are common enough to barely merit comment. These injuries aren't treated with surgery, physical therapy, or pain management. They're simply incorporated into the person's reality, requiring adaptation of techniques and expectations rather than medical intervention. The physical burdens fall disproportionately across social categories. Women's bodies bear the additional strain of frequent pregnancies without modern medical care, often beginning in their early teens and continuing until death or menopause. You observe women in their 20s who have already experienced 5 or 6 pregnancies, their bodies showing the cumulative effects of these demands alongside their daily labor. Men face different physical risks, more likely to experience traumatic injuries from construction, warfare, or dangerous trades, their bodies used as expendable resources in the most hazardous situations. The physical dangers of travel become apparent as you observe a merchant caravan preparing to depart. The carefully armed guards, the strategic timing to reach known water sources, the calculated risks of different routes balancing distance against exposure to bandits or hostile territories all highlight how movement through the landscape carries significant threats. Modern concepts of tourism or recreational travel would seem incomprehensible. People travel from necessity, accepting inherent dangers as unavoidable costs of trade, pilgrimage, or relocation. Natural disasters present particularly acute physical challenges. Without modern forecasting, early warning systems, or emergency response infrastructure, communities face environmental threats with minimal preparation. You witness the aftermath of a flash flood that swept through a valley with little warning, destroying homes and drowning livestock. The survivors don't receive disaster relief funds or temporary housing. They rely entirely on community support to rebuild, replanting fields even as they repair dwellings, knowing that delay means starvation in the coming season. Disease outbreaks transform communities in ways modern humans can barely imagine after experiencing COVID, with the advantages of scientific understanding, global communication, and medical interventions. You observe a settlement where some unidentified contagion, perhaps typhoid or dysentery, has taken hold. Without understanding of transmission vectors, effective treatments, or isolation protocols, the disease spreads through families and neighbors. Those who can flee to unaffected areas, while others attempt various traditional remedies, religious rituals, or simply accept their fate as divine judgment. The psychological impact of constant physical vulnerability creates distinctive patterns of thought and behavior. You notice how biblical people incorporate risk assessment into every decision, not as formal process, but as instinctive calculation. Which water source is safer? Which route presents fewer dangers? Which food preservation method is more reliable? Modern humans, protected by safety regulations, consumer protections, and medical interventions, rarely face such consequential daily choices. The biblical mind develops heightened awareness of environmental threats and relational dangers as essential survival mechanism. This constant physical precarity shapes religious understanding in profound ways. Divine protection isn't abstract theological concept, but urgent daily necessity. Prayers for safety, health, and provision aren't ceremonial formalities, but desperate appeals for survival. The biblical text's emphasis on God as shield, fortress, and deliverer reflects lived experience of physical vulnerability rather than metaphorical language. When psalmists write of God guarding their steps or protecting them from enemies, they express concrete hopes for survival in a dangerous world. The concept of physical purity takes on different significance in this context. Without germ theory or microscopic understanding, the biblical purity laws create practical boundaries against many actual health threats. Regulations regarding bodily discharges, food preparation, contact with corpses, and water sources serve partially as primitive public health measures. Even while understood primarily in religious terms, the interconnection of physical and spiritual purity reflects an integrated worldview where body and spirit aren't separate domains but aspects of unified human existence. Physical disabilities in this setting carry different meanings and consequences than in modern contexts. Without assistive technologies, educational accommodations, or disability rights frameworks, people with physical limitations must find whatever contributive role they can within extremely demanding circumstances. You notice a man with a withered leg who has developed specialized skill in a seated craft. A woman with limited vision who processes wool by touch. A child with developmental differences who tends small animals. The community accommodates these differences not from philosophical commitment to inclusion, but practical necessity. Every person must contribute whatever they can to collective survival. The physical environment shapes relationship patterns in ways modern humans might find deterministic. People marry partners from nearby villages because physical travel limitations restrict broader options. Occupations follow family lines because proximity allows for apprenticeship. Social circles remain relatively consistent throughout life because geographic mobility is limited. The modern expectation of selecting from vast potential relationship pools, whether for friendship, romance, or professional connection, would seem not just unlikely, but incomprehensible in a world where physical proximity largely determines social possibility. You observe how physical spaces structure social interactions and relationships. The village well creates a natural gathering point where information exchanges, potential marriages are assessed, and community bonds form through daily interaction. The threshing floor becomes temporary social hub during harvest season. Community relationships strengthened through shared physical labor. Religious structures, whether modest local shrines or elaborate temples, create spaces where different social classes interact under specific protocols. Physical proximity enabling social connections otherwise prevented by status boundaries. The close physical proximity of daily life creates relationship patterns unlike modern norms. Privacy doesn't exist as contemporary concept or expectation. Family members sleep in shared spaces, often on the same mats or platforms. Bodily functions occur with minimal separation. Conversations are overheard by default. Emotional states are immediately visible to household members. This constant proximity creates both intense bonds and inevitable tensions, managed through cultural norms rather than physical boundaries. Physical touch functions differently in biblical relationships. You notice how same, gender physical affection, men embracing, women walking with linked arms, friends sharing sleeping space coexists with strict regulations on cross-gender contact. Touch serves as communication system, the firm grip conveying warning, the gentle hand on shoulder offering comfort, the kiss of greeting establishing relationship status. In a world without text messages or phone calls, physical proximity and contact provide primary communication channels that modern technology has largely replaced. The physical demands of survival necessitate interdependent relationships that modern individualism has difficulty comprehending. No single person or nuclear family can manage all necessary tasks for survival: growing food, processing harvests, manufacturing tools, constructing dwellings, providing defense, preserving cultural knowledge. You observe how even tasks that seem simple, like making bread, involve multiple relationship networks: the farmers who grew grain, the traders who transported millstones from appropriate quarries, the well diggers who created water access, the potters who crafted ovens. Biblical community isn't ideological choice, but practical necessity. The physical realities of death create different relationship patterns with mortality. Death occurs visibly within community spaces, not hidden in hospitals or care facilities. Bodies are prepared for burial by family members, not professional services. Graves are often near living spaces, maintaining physical proximity between living and dead. Children witness death regularly, developing different psychological relationship with mortality than modern protected childhoods allow. The physical processes of death, the sounds of labored breathing, the smells of decay, the visual changes in the corpse are familiar rather than clinical or abstract. Relationships with animals reflect their essential roles in physical survival rather than emotional companionship. You observe the shepherd who knows each sheep individually but will slaughter them without hesitation when necessary. The farmer who treats working animals with care but as tools rather than pets. The complex interdependence between humans and livestock creates relationships of mutual dependence but clearly hierarchical purpose. Animals aren't family members but critical resources requiring proper management for community survival. The physical environment itself becomes relationship partner rather than background setting or resource to exploit. You notice how people read subtle environmental cues, cloud patterns, plant behaviors, animal movements as communication from their surroundings. The relationship with land, water sources, and local ecosystems involves responsive adaptation rather than attempted domination. Seasonal rituals acknowledge dependence on environmental cooperation, expressing relationship with physical world through religious frameworks rather than scientific management. The experience of physical pain transforms fundamental aspects of consciousness. Without effective analgesics, pain becomes constant companion requiring integration rather than elimination. You observe people working through conditions that modern humans would consider debilitating: toothaches, arthritis injuries, chronic infections. The biblical text's frequent references to suffering reflect this reality. Pain isn't exceptional circumstance, but expected life component requiring spiritual interpretation and community support rather than medical intervention. The physical practices of hospitality take on life or death significance rather than social nicety. Providing water, food, and shelter to travelers isn't optional kindness, but moral obligation in environment where these necessities cannot be purchased at convenience. You watch as a family with barely enough food for themselves shares their meal with a stranger, not from abundance but recognition of common vulnerability to elements and dangers of travel. The elaborate biblical regulations and narratives regarding hospitality reflect this survival reality. Today's host may be tomorrow's desperate traveler. Relationships with powerful individuals, whether tribal leaders, religious authorities, or regional rulers, directly impact physical survival in ways modern citizens of functional states rarely experience. You observe the careful navigation of these power relationships, the strategic deference, the calculated gifts, the indirect communication patterns that develop when physical well-being depends on maintaining favor with authority figures. Biblical narrative accounts of interactions with kings or officials aren't primarily political commentary, but practical guides to surviving power imbalances. The physical environment shapes everything from large-scale political organizations to intimate family patterns. Desert regions produce nomadic tribal structures with distinctive kinship patterns and religious practices. Agricultural areas develop different settlement patterns, inheritance customs, and religious calendars aligned with farming cycles. Coastal communities establish trade networks, cultural exchange systems, and religious practices reflecting maritime realities. The biblical texts reflect this environmental determinism. Different regions produce distinctive relationship patterns, religious expressions, and social structures based on physical possibilities and constraints. The experience of physical slavery, a common reality in biblical contexts, creates relationship patterns unimaginable to modern free persons. You witness the complex adaptation strategies of enslaved individuals, the careful reading of masters' moods, the strategic performance of compliance, the hidden maintenance of dignity and identity despite physical subjugation. The biblical text's regulations regarding slavery reflect attempts to create minimal protections within a system accepted as normal rather than endorsement of the practice. Rules limiting physical abuse, establishing Sabbath rest, and requiring eventual freedom for some categories of enslaved persons. Physical appearance and presentation serve different social functions in biblical contexts. Without photography, identification relies on distinctive physical features, clothing markers, and behavioral patterns. You notice how tribal or regional identity appears immediately visible through distinctive garment styles, hair arrangements, or jewelry. Status distinctions manifest physically: quality of clothing, presence of decorative elements, posture and movement patterns shaped by lifetime activities. Gender presentation follows strict visual codes reinforced through religious regulations and social expectations. Seasonal changes dramatically affect relationship patterns through their impact on physical activities and proximity. Winter drives people into shared indoor spaces, intensifying both intimacy and conflict. Summer disperses communities into fields and pastures, creating different social configurations around work activities. Harvest seasons require all community participation, temporarily suspending some status distinctions through shared physical labor. The physical necessity of seasonal adaptation creates social flexibility within otherwise rigid hierarchical structures. The experience of physical hunger shapes social bonds in ways well-fed modern humans cannot fully comprehend. You observe how food sharing becomes primary expression of relationship, the portion size offered to guests indicating their importance. The quality of food presented reflecting respect, the invitation to eat from common vessels, establishing intimacy. The biblical text's frequent reference to meals, feasts, and food distribution reflects this reality. Eating together isn't casual social activity, but fundamental relationship definition and maintenance. The physical vulnerability of women in pregnancy and childbirth creates distinctive relationship patterns. You notice the knowledge networks among experienced women who assist in births, the practical support systems that develop to maintain household function when a woman is physically compromised, the community rituals surrounding successful delivery that acknowledge survival rather than merely celebrating new life. The biblical narrative accounts of difficult births, maternal deaths, and infertility reflect these physical realities that shaped women's experience and social position. The physical requirements of nursing infants structure women's daily patterns, social connections, and community roles. Without formula, refrigeration, or breast pumps, nursing mothers must remain in close physical proximity to their infants, creating both limitations and specialized social networks. You observe how nursing women gather while completing compatible tasks, sharing knowledge, building relationships through this shared physical experience. The biblical references to weaning as significant transition mark the end of this physically intensive period and shift in both child and mother's social position. Physical developmental stages create relationship transitions at different points than modern norms. Children move from primarily maternal care to gender-appropriate work groups around age 5 or 6, beginning apprenticeship in adult skills. Girls experience significant status change at first menstruation, becoming potential marriage partners. Boys undergo various coming-of-age transitions marked by physical capabilities rather than chronological age. The biblical accounts of childhood rarely include extended developmental periods. Children are presented as small adults in training rather than distinct category with specialized needs. The physical spaces where relationships develop carry different significance and function than modern equivalents. Without dedicated single-purpose buildings, most relationships form through multi-purpose shared activities. Religious instruction happens alongside physical labor. Commercial transactions include social dimensions. Political discussions occur in markets or village gates rather than specialized government buildings. You notice how the threshing floor transforms from agricultural workspace to public meeting venue to festival site, depending on season and need. This spatial flexibility creates relationship patterns where boundaries between activities remain permeable rather than compartmentalized. The physical necessity of manual skill transmission shapes intergenerational relationships. Without written instruction manuals, YouTube tutorials, or formalized education, essential survival skills pass directly from experienced practitioners to novices through physical demonstration, guided practice, and embodied correction. You observe an elder teaching a child to form clay vessels, their hands overlapping, as the adult guides the younger through proper motions. These physically intimate teaching relationships create bonds that modern instructional methods rarely achieve. The knowledge lives in bodies rather than texts, making physical proximity essential to cultural continuation. The biblical landscape you've been experiencing isn't merely a static setting for daily survival, but the stage for pivotal events that shaped religious understanding and community identity. As you continue your immersion in this ancient world, you begin to witness how transformative moments, both catastrophic and transcendent, punctuate the relentless rhythm of daily existence. Famine represents one of the most common community-altering events in biblical narratives, and experiencing it firsthand reveals why it occupies such central place in cultural memory and religious interpretation. Unlike modern food shortages that might mean limited options or higher prices, biblical famine means watching crops wither in fields despite all human effort, seeing livestock grow skeletal before dying, feeling your own body consume itself from within. You observe how community cohesion both strengthens and fractures under this pressure, initial resource, sharing giving way to desperate self-preservation as conditions worsen. The physical and psychological impacts of prolonged hunger transform every aspect of existence. Cognitive function deteriorates, making even simple decisions difficult. Emotional regulation fails, with minor frustrations triggering disproportionate reactions. Physical weakness prevents completion of necessary tasks, creating dangerous cycles of diminishing returns on labor. The biblical accounts of families selling children into slavery during famines, of people eating forbidden foods, or even considering cannibalism, reflect not moral failures, but the extremity of biological desperation that overwhelms social norms and religious prohibitions. Drought, often famine's precursor, creates its own distinctive community trauma. You experience the psychological weight of scanning cloudless skies day after day, the communal anxiety as water sources gradually diminish, the increasingly desperate religious rituals attempting to secure divine intervention. Wells become flashpoints for conflict as water tables drop. Previously cooperative neighboring communities become competitors for diminishing resources. The biblical emphasis on God sending or withholding rain reflects this central vulnerability. All human effort proves futile without this essential element beyond human control. Plague and epidemic disease create different patterns of community disruption. Unlike modern outbreaks faced with scientific understanding and medical resources, biblical communities experience these as mysterious divine judgments or attacks from unseen forces. You witness how rapidly social structures collapse when disease sweeps through a settlement, care systems overwhelmed, flight competing with obligation to family, religious interpretations ranging from punishment for specific sins to tests of faithfulness. The biblical accounts of plagues emphasize their apparent selectivity and sudden onset or cessation, reinforcing theological interpretations of divine causation and purpose. Military invasion and conquest represent another category of community, transforming events prominent in biblical narratives. Experiencing these firsthand reveals dimensions absent from sanitized historical accounts. You witness the approach of foreign armies, first rumors carried by refugees from outlying regions, then dust clouds visible on horizons, finally the terrifying reality of armed strangers entering community spaces. The impossible choices facing communities, hopeless resistance, attempted flight, or surrender with its own unpredictable consequences, create moral complexities beyond simple categories of courage or cowardice. The aftermath of conquest brings new layers of physical and psychological suffering. You observe the brutal efficiency of ancient warfare, military, aged men killed to prevent future rebellion, young women taken as captives and concubines, children forcibly relocated and assimilated into conquering cultures, elders left without support systems. The destruction extends beyond human casualties to community infrastructure, irrigation systems damaged, orchards cut down, walls demolished, sacred spaces desecrated. Recovery requires not just rebuilding physical structures, but reconstructing social systems and religious understanding to incorporate this collective trauma. Exile, the forced relocation of communities to foreign territories, creates particularly profound disruption to identity and religious practice. Unlike voluntary migration, exile combines physical displacement with political subjugation and religious crisis. You witness families being forcibly marched from ancestral lands, carrying minimal possessions, facing unknown destinations and conditions. The physical hardships of these journeys, exposure to elements, inadequate food and water, vulnerability to illness and attack, create selection pressures that permanently alter community demographics, with the most vulnerable dying before reaching destinations. The experience of living in exile transforms every dimension of community life. Religious practices designed for specific sacred spaces must adapt to foreign settings. Dietary restrictions become both more difficult to maintain and more important as markers of resistant identity. Marriage patterns shift under pressures of assimilation and survival. Language undergoes accelerated change through contact with dominant cultures. The biblical literature produced during and after exile periods, from prophetic works to wisdom collections, reflects these transformative pressures, wrestling with questions of divine purpose, community boundaries, and faithful adaptation. Natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, destructive storms create moments when theological understanding faces direct challenge from physical experience. You witness a community in the aftermath of a major earthquake, homes destroyed without regard for residents' moral character, religious buildings collapsed alongside secular structures, the seeming randomness of survival or death. The biblical texts offer multiple interpretive frameworks for such events: divine judgment, tests of faith, opportunities for redemption, cosmic conflict, reflecting the ongoing struggle to create meaning from experiences that threaten to overwhelm existing theological systems. Against this background of community-altering catastrophes, the biblical world also witnesses moments of transcendent encounter and revelation that transform understanding and practice. You observe a prophetic calling, a previously ordinary community member who begins speaking with compelling authority, claiming direct divine communication, often delivering messages that challenge existing power structures or religious interpretations. The community response reveals complex dynamics of discernment, some embracing the prophetic word, others rejecting it, religious authorities attempting to evaluate its authenticity against established traditions. The establishment of covenant relationships, formalized agreements between divine and human parties, represents another category of transformative event in biblical narratives. You witness the elaborate rituals that solemnize these agreements: animal sacrifices, shared meals, public recitations of obligations, physical markers erected as reminders. Unlike modern contracts focused on individual parties, these covenant establishments involve entire communities across generations, creating identity boundaries and ethical frameworks that persist through physical and political changes. Victory over enemies, especially when against apparent odds, becomes transformative through its interpretation as divine intervention rather than military strategy or numerical advantage. You experience a community's transition from terror to triumph as threatening forces are defeated, the immediate relief expanding into revised theological understanding and commemorative practices. The biblical accounts of such victories, from Exodus to conquest narratives to returns from exile, typically minimize human agency while emphasizing divine action, transforming military history into religious foundation. Harvest festivals represent more positive community defining events, celebrating survival through another agricultural cycle, while reinforcing religious understanding of divine provision. You participate in the physical and emotional release these occasions permit, the temporary abundance after months of careful rationing, the suspension of normal work demands, the reinforcement of community bonds through shared celebration. The biblical festival calendar institutionalizes these moments, connecting agricultural cycles with historical commemorations and theological affirmations. Religious innovations and reforms periodically transform community practice and understanding. You witness how changes initiated by religious authorities or charismatic leaders, whether returning to purportedly original practices or adapting to new circumstances, create both cohesion and conflict within communities. The biblical accounts of religious reforms under various leaders reflect these dynamics: initial resistance giving way to acceptance, competing interpretations of proper practice, the gradual normalization of changes until they become traditional themselves. The construction or reconstruction of sacred spaces, whether portable tabernacles, local shrines, or centralized temples, creates focal points for community identity and religious practice. You observe the massive mobilization of resources these projects require, the specialized knowledge transmitted through craft guilds, the community cohesion fostered through shared purpose. The biblical text's detailed attention to sanctuary specifications reflects both practical construction requirements and theological significance. These spaces physically embody religious understanding through their materials, dimensions, and arrangements. The Exodus narrative exemplifies how physical experience becomes foundational religious memory. You witness the desperation of enslaved communities, the soul-crushing labor, the systemic oppression, the psychological impact of generation after generation born into servitude without hope of change. Against this background, liberation becomes not merely political transition, but cosmic reordering, divine intervention into seemingly immutable conditions. The physical journey through hostile environments, confronting thirst in deserts, encountering enemies in unfamiliar territories, navigating without maps or secure routes transforms a population of slaves into a covenantal community with distinctive identity and purpose. Wilderness wandering periods appear repeatedly in biblical narratives as transformative intervals between established identities. You experience how these liminal times create both extreme vulnerability and unusual possibilities. Without permanent settlements, normal social hierarchies become more fluid. Without established agricultural routines, dependency on direct provision becomes more evident. Without familiar landmarks, guidance requires greater attentiveness to divine direction. The biblical accounts of wilderness periods emphasize both their dangers, murmuring, rebellion, regression to previous identities, and their formative potential for creating new community configurations and religious understandings. Divine visitation narratives punctuate biblical history, creating moments when supernatural presence becomes sensory experience rather than theological concept. You witness the community preparation for such encounters, the washing of garments, the sexual abstinence, the physical boundaries established around sacred space. The multi-sensory nature of these experiences strikes you, thunder and lightning, thick cloud, ground shaking, the sound of trumpets growing louder. The aftermath reveals transformation beyond cognitive understanding, faces shining from divine proximity, individuals physically marked by encounter, communities reoriented around fresh revelation of divine character and expectation. Succession moments, the transfer of leadership authority from one generation to another, create particularly vulnerable transitions in communities dependent on clear direction and unifying leadership. You observe the elaborate rituals that accompany these transitions, public ceremonies, symbolic transfers of authority objects, communal affirmations of the successor. The biblical narratives frankly acknowledge the risks. These moments present siblings or factions competing for authority, previous administrative structures resisting new leadership styles, external enemies exploiting transition weakness. Successful successions become paradigmatic, their patterns replicated across generations to minimize disruption and maintain connection to founding authorities. The reception of divine law represents a uniquely transformative event category, establishing behavioral boundaries and ethical frameworks that define community identity across changing circumstances. You experience firsthand how these law codes address the concrete challenges of agricultural communities, land distribution practices preventing extreme inequality, debt forgiveness cycles preventing permanent underclasses, resource management promoting environmental sustainability. Unlike abstract philosophical systems, these legal frameworks emerge from specific physical contexts while creating adaptable principles applicable beyond their original settings. The biblical portrayal of law reception emphasizes divine origin, while historical analysis reveals adaptation of existing legal traditions to specific community needs. The establishment of monarchy creates fundamental tension within biblical communities originally structured around tribal confederations and direct divine guidance through prophetic leadership. You witness the practical pressures that drive this transition, external military threats requiring more centralized response, internal coordination challenges as population grows, desire for stability and consistent governance beyond charismatic individual leaders. The biblical accounts present remarkably nuanced assessment of this development, acknowledging legitimate needs, while warning of inevitable corruption, recognizing practical benefits while mourning the theological compromise of human king replacing divine sovereignty. Temple dedication moments function as community, defining events that physically institutionalize religious practice and theological understanding. You observe the elaborate preparations, years of material collection, specialized craftspeople brought from surrounding regions, purification rituals for workers and spaces. The dedication ceremonies themselves create sensory experiences that reinforce theological concepts. the overwhelming abundance of sacrifices communicating divine generosity, the architectural features embodying cosmic order, the cloud of divine presence visibly filling the completed structure. These physical structures subsequently anchor community identity even when political fortunes change, creating continuity across disruptions of exile and return. Prophetic confrontations with monarchy represent another category of transformative moments in biblical narratives, establishing tension between political and religious authority that persists throughout the tradition. You witness these high-stakes encounters, the prophet without institutional power challenging the king with military forces and execution authority, the appeal to higher divine law against royal decree, the physical courage required to deliver unwelcome messages to volatile rulers. These confrontations establish principles of moral accountability that transcend political position, creating ethical frameworks that judge leaders by standards beyond military success or economic prosperity. Periods of apostasy and return create cycles of identity loss and recovery that shape biblical community self-understanding. You experience how readily established religious practices erode under various pressures, convenience, assimilation to dominant cultures, attractive alternatives promising better outcomes, gradual drift through neglect rather than deliberate rejection. The biblical narratives trace these cycles without idealization, acknowledging human tendencies toward compromise while celebrating moments of renewal and return. These patterns create both caution against complacency and hope for restoration regardless of how far deviation has progressed. Birth narratives of significant leaders often mark transformative moments when new historical possibilities emerge through unexpected beginnings. You witness how these narratives emphasize vulnerability, children born in dangerous circumstances, exposure to genocidal policies, humble origins contrasting with eventual significance. The biblical accounts highlight divine orchestration of seemingly coincidental factors, the daughter of Pharaoh happening upon Moses, Samuel's mother bringing him to the temple at the right moment, David being summoned from the fields when Samuel visits. These narratives undercut natural human tendency to attribute successful outcomes to personal merit or family advantage, emphasizing instead divine purpose working through unlikely instruments. Death and succession narratives of major figures create transitional moments that test community identity and continuity. You observe the elaborate mourning rituals, the public wailing, the tearing of garments, the eulogies recounting the deceased's contribution to community welfare. Beyond emotional expression, these practices serve essential social functions, acknowledging the reality of loss, providing structured transition between leadership regimes, incorporating the deceased's memory into ongoing community identity. The biblical accounts of these transitions emphasize continuity of divine purpose across human generations, while honestly portraying the distinctive contributions and limitations of individual leaders. As we transition toward conclusion, the contrast between biblical and modern experience becomes increasingly stark. The physical immersion you've experienced in this ancient world reveals dimensions of biblical texts invisible to modern readers approaching them primarily as literary or theological documents. The sensory reality of biblical life, its smells and textures, its physical demands and bodily vulnerabilities, its environmental exposures and material limitations creates cognitive and emotional frameworks fundamentally different from contemporary experience. This gap between biblical and modern worlds creates both interpretive challenges and potential insights. The physical realities you've witnessed help explain why certain concerns dominate biblical texts, while others receive minimal attention. Food security, water access, and physical safety occupy central place because they represent constant existential threats. Physical illness receives theological interpretation because scientific explanation remains unavailable. Community boundaries become critically important because individual survival depends on group membership and support. The religious frameworks that developed within these physical contexts served essential functions beyond theological expression. They provided explanatory systems for otherwise confusing or terrifying experiences: why crops fail, why children die, why enemies triumph. They created ethical boundaries that promoted group survival in harsh environments, sharing resources with vulnerable community members, limiting vengeful cycles, maintaining production discipline through regular rest. They established identity markers allowing community maintenance despite political disruption, dietary practices, physical modifications, distinctive clothing or behaviors. Modern attempts to directly translate biblical practices often miss these contextual dimensions, creating distortions rather than authentic continuity. You recognize how removing biblical instructions from their physical environment and social structures fundamentally changes their function and meaning. Sabbath observance operates differently in agricultural subsistence communities than in industrial or digital economies. Purity regulations serve different purposes in environments without germ theory or sanitation infrastructure. Gender roles structured around physical survival tasks transform when divorced from those material conditions. Yet, despite these contextual differences, the biblical world offers insights that modern experience often obscures. The inescapable physicality of biblical life highlights dimensions of human existence minimized in increasingly digital, mediated modern environments. The biblical integration of physical and spiritual domains challenges modern compartmentalization. The emphasis on community interdependence counterbalances extreme individualism. The direct engagement with environmental limitations raises questions about sustainability and material sufficiency relevant to contemporary challenges. The profound vulnerability of biblical existence to hunger and thirst, to disease and injury, to climate and catastrophe creates spiritual perspectives difficult to access from positions of relative security and abundance. The desperate prayers for daily bread emerge from genuine uncertainty about next meals, not ritualized gratitude for readily available food. The wrestling with divine justice occurs within experiences of seemingly arbitrary suffering, not theoretical discussions of philosophical concepts. The hope for future redemption sustains communities through genuine present adversity, not abstract eschatological speculation. As night falls on the biblical landscape you've been experiencing, you notice how darkness transforms the community in ways modern illuminated environments prevent. Activities cease with sunset by necessity, not by choice. Stars become prominent without light pollution, their patterns providing both navigation guidance and calendrical orientation. Human voices carry differently in the still darkness, conversations around small fires creating intimacy impossible in daylight labor. Sleep patterns follow natural rhythms rather than artificial schedules, with periods of waking and talking punctuating the night. This transition from day to night mirrors larger patterns of biblical understanding: light and darkness, life and death, presence and absence, revelation and mystery. The physical realities shape metaphorical frameworks, concrete experience becoming interpretive lens for abstract concepts. The biblical emphasis on light as divine attribute and darkness as realm requiring divine presence emerges naturally from the genuine vulnerability darkness represents in this environment, the legitimate fears it engenders, the real limitations it imposes. Looking back across your immersion in this biblical landscape, you recognize how profoundly the physical environment shapes everything from daily practical activities to highest theological concepts. The biblical texts emerge not as abstract philosophical treatises or disembodied spiritual instructions, but as embodied responses to concrete challenges of human existence in specific material conditions. Their enduring power comes partly from addressing fundamental human experiences that persist despite technological and social changes: vulnerability, suffering, wonder, connection, meaning-making in the face of mortality. The distance between biblical and modern worlds remains vast, unbridgeable through simple translation or application. Yet the journey through biblical physical reality creates possibilities for genuine engagement with these ancient texts beyond either uncritical acceptance or dismissive rejection. Understanding the material conditions that shaped biblical communities doesn't require adopting their specific practices or worldviews, but it does create space for recognizing the legitimate human needs and insights their traditions address, however different our contemporary responses might be. As you prepare to return to modern existence with its distinctive comforts and challenges, the physical immersion in biblical reality leaves lasting impressions, greater appreciation for basic resources often taken for granted, recognition of community interdependence masked by modern individualism, awareness of environmental vulnerabilities despite technological buffers, and perhaps most significantly, deeper understanding of how physical circumstances shape spiritual perspectives and religious practices across human experience. The biblical world you've experienced remains both foreign and familiar, distant in its material conditions and cultural assumptions, yet recognizable in its fundamental human struggles and aspirations. The physical journey through this landscape creates not definitive answers about how to interpret or apply biblical texts, but richer questions about their contexts, purposes, and potential contemporary relevance. The embodied knowledge gained through this immersion complements intellectual analysis, creating more nuanced engagement with these influential texts and traditions that continue to shape global cultures and individual lives across radically changed physical circumstances.